it got copied. So now, can you see there are only 2 records? So now in case if I remove this and use upsert, there would still be 2 records only because the records are already present. Now, write batch size. Imagine that there are millions of rows I have. What Microsoft copy activity does is, it does not copy all the million rows in one instance. It copies those rows in batches, in some chunks. Now, in case if you want to have a fixed value that you want to control in how much chunks of rows should the data be written, that is where the write batch size can be, wherein you can provide a specific value and in those chunks that it would copy the data into the corresponding destination. This is with respect to the copy activity with Azure SQL database as a destination. Now there is something called as mapping and source. And in source, there is something called as an advanced property called additional columns. We covered all other properties except this property called additional columns. Now, up till now, we were copying the data as is from source to destination. Meaning whatever columns were present in the source were getting copied into the destination as is. But imagine that I want to add some additional columns, some log columns. Then is there a way to do that? Yes, it is possible through something called as additional columns in the source settings. And we'll come to that. Parallelly, there is something called as mapping. Imagine that my source has 2 columns and source has 3 columns and my sink has 2 columns. Or my source name, okay, let me create another table. Create auto dot copy sink. Rather than C1, C2, let me add CS1 varchar, comma CS2 varchar. So I created a new table, auto sync. So now let me create a copy active. Let me deactivate this. Let me use this. Here under destination, rather than, or I want to use the existing table. In the existing table, it can provide me a drop down by connecting to that data base table, or I can manually provide it. So now what exactly is happening is Microsoft is executing a query called select star from informations underscore schema dot tables. It is trying to get me the list of tables that is present. So now I want to copy it into auto.copy sync. I can preview the data, whether there is any data present here or not. So it would be blank since there is no data available. Now, in case if I execute the copy activity, my source file has column name C1, C2. My destination has column name CS1, CS2. So would my copy activity be successful or would it fail? Any guess?
And can you repeat one more time?
Now, my source Excel file had column name C1, C2. Correct? But my destination table now contains column name as CS1, CS2. So would the copy activity be successful or would it fail? It failed. Now let's check the error message. It states that column C1 is not found in the target side. So in the earlier scenario, the source and the destination had similar column names. So Microsoft data pipeline was smart enough to do a one-on-one mapping between the same column names. But in this case, source has different column names as compared to sink. It is not smart enough to understand that I want to map it this to this, because no one can be smart enough, correct? Because it's up to the user who knows what is the correct mapping between the source and the sink. As long as the column names between the source and sink are same, there is no use or no need of having something called as mappings. But imagine that in case if your source and sink column names are different, then I have to do a one-on-one mapping between the source column to the sink column. That's where the setting of mapping comes in. Or imagine that out of 3 columns, I want to do not copy one of the column. Then I'll disable that mapping. So this is the significance of mapping. So one aspect is you can manually create a mapping, correct? Wherein you can add C1 column maps to CS1 column. Either you can do a manual mapping or you can try to import the schema. What the import schema does is it automatically imports the schema of the source and the sink, and then you can create a mapping between the same. So now what I'm doing is I'm importing the schema or the metadata of my source file and sink file, sink destination. So now, is this the mapping that I want? I want C1 column to be mapped to CS1, or I can map it to C. Accordingly, now this is the mapping that I have defined, correct? I want C1 to map to C2. Any queries? So now a one-on-one mapping has been created between the source column to the sink column. Now, in case if I execute this, I should be able to see the data in some once the data gets copied. Auto.copy sync. Now it's 0 because the data is still getting copied. It has yet not got copied. But imagine that my file has millions of rows and I write data in batches. Then every time you execute this select query, the count would keep on increasing because the data are getting copied into batches. So now the data got copied. 1, 1, 2, 2. So team, any queries on the concept of mapping within the copy activity and what is the need of the copy mapping? What is the need of the mapping functionality?
To map the source to destination.
In case if the column names are different, or imagine that your column names are same across source and sink, but the mapping needs to be different. What Microsoft would do is C1 to C1 automatically. But if you want to map C1 to C2, at that time you can explicitly come into the mapping section, and rather than allowing Microsoft to assume anything, you can explicitly provide the mapping that you want. Now imagine that if I delete this column, this mapping, now in case if I execute this pipeline, what would happen? Any idea?
Will fail.
Who all feel this would fail? Okay, so most of them are thinking it would be successful, or they don't have any opinion in this case. Okay, no response. This got executed successfully. Now let's go and validate the data. Can you see? Only C1 column got populated, C2 column is null. It is because I explicitly defined that only copy C1 column values. Do not copy C2. If you'll remember, I had stated, correct? Imagine that if your source multiple columns which you do not want to map it into sync, you can delete it from the respective mappings. And that's what I did. I do not want to map C2 column into my destination. I want to exclude that column into the copy aspect. At that time, you can go and delete the corresponding mapping. Clear? Is the concept clear? Okay. Now, let's come to the another concept of source, that is additional columns. Imagine that I do want to map some additional columns like logs, etc. Now, what type of additional columns can be there? Let's see. So now I created a new column. Let me provide a column name called audit log. The value can be the file path, etc. Or you can have some custom values. Now the custom value can be, I can add a dynamic content here. Now I can add any of these values. Like, let me take the function UTC now. I want to get the current date. Okay, my fault. I want a dynamic value to be present. Let me select the parameter name itself. Now, this is okay. Here, I'm not providing any column name. Okay, for now, let's ignore this aspect. Let me add a value 1, 2, 3. Correct. It is not allowing me this dynamic drop down due to some issue. For now, let's say that I want to add a static value. I added a column called audit log. Now under mappings, I want to add the audit log. Now, why am I not seeing audit log column? Because I had imported the schema initially. But now in case if I import the schema again, that audit log column would pop in. Because it has that cache of the original one, correct? It's now that I added that new column, the additional column. I want to copy audit log into the CS2 column now. So this is the mapping that I'll do. And now in case if I execute this, this get executed. Now remember that in case of copy activity, it copies the source data as is from your source to destination. You cannot do any transformations on your data. Just that you can add additional columns, but you cannot make any modifications on your existing data. So the copy data activity copies your data as is from your source to destination with some additional columns in case if need be. So this is the typical case when you want to move your data as is from one location to another, or for migration related activities wherein you want to create a clone of your data, or you want to take a backup wherein you want to keep your data as is without any modifications. So now in case if I query this table, I'll see that 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, because the default value of that additional column got added into the corresponding CS2 column. Now, rather than having it as a hard-coded value of 1, 2, 3, I can have a dynamic value like UTC now, etc. But due to some issue, I am unable to map a dynamic value here. It's asking me for a dynamic value at this content. Now, in case if I import these schemas, can you see? Because undefined, I am unable to define the corresponding additional column name in the source aspect. Hence, it is unable to get that corresponding definition. So the dynamic expression is not able to match here due to some issue, I guess, at the Microsoft end. I can quickly show it at the Azure Data Factory side, what it looks like. I hope that's not an issue in the Azure Data Factory. So let me quickly go over to my resource group. See, as I said, the Azure data, the Fabric data pipelines is hosted on the Azure Data Factory itself. So overall concept remains the same. So I'll quickly show an aspect of the data factory that it should work fine. I need to check what is happening in the Fabric data pipeline. So team, any queries on the concept of additional columns? So by the time Azure Data Factory is loading, in copy activity, then there is a final aspect called settings. What does this represent? Intelligent throughput optimization. Then degree of copy parallelism, meaning you want to parallelly copy the data, correct? Do you want it to be auto or do you want to have fixed? This is to manage the performance of your copy activity. Auto meaning Microsoft automatically takes the best possible case. But imagine if you want it to be always the peak copy aspect, you can set it specifically to 32. Usually it is preferred to have auto unless there is major performance issue challenges. Now, fault tolerance. Based on the terminology called fault tolerance, can anyone state what it might be? Any idea on what fault tolerance might be? At least give some thought. No idea, no guess. Okay. Fault tolerance means when you are copying the data from one source to a destination. So when you are copying the data from source to destination, let's say I'm copying the data from a file into my Azure SQL database table. And in my table, one of my column data type is integer. And in my source file, in one of the row in that column, rather than integer, there is a string value. So in case fault tolerance is not enabled, what would happen is copying that data while coming into that specific row, the copy activity would fail, stating that string to int conversion is not possible and it would fail then and there itself. The subsequent rows won't get copied. But the earlier rows that were copied would remain as is. What does that mean? Copy activity is not transaction bound. If you remember, I stated, correct, that copy activity writes the data in the batches, in particular batch of data. So imagine in first batch, the data got copied properly. In the second batch, in one of the row, there was an issue in the data type. So the earlier rows that were copied into batch 2 are also in the destination, but future rows won't get copied into that and the pipeline would fail and stop there itself, assuming what type of dependencies you all have set. But imagine that rather just because of one row, I do not want to disable my job. I want it to continue. So at that time, you set something called as a fault tolerance. So in that case, what I'll do is I'll skip incompatible rows. Or imagine that in case if there are some files that are missing, I'll select skip missing files, etc. Meaning whatever incompatibility is there, skip it rather than filling it there itself. And whenever you enable fault tolerance, you have to enable a storage layer in between, because the objects or the rows that are not correct needs to be logged in somewhere. So those get logged into the storage layer. Now that storage layer has to be Azure Data Lake storage or Azure Blob storage itself. Since I already have a connection the shortcut storage logging level, I want only the warning, I want the information to be preserved. I want the information to be preserved. Then folder path, I can keep it within the shortcut folder. I can browse it into the corresponding where I want the log file to be generated. So I want it to be loaded within the shortcut folder. And unfortunately, unlike the copy activity wherein I can provide the file name, here the file that is created is some random GUID value with extension CSV. And I want to enable staging. Or I do not want to enable staging. I want to load it directly. So in this case, my source file contains values like 1112. Correct. Now, rather than that, let me tweak my destination a bit. Let's say select all from AutoSync. Okay. Correct. This is varchar. Let me create a new table called AutoSync fault CS2 and make it integer CS2 column. So now in my copy activity, let me add the destination as enter manually copy fault, and in the mapping, I'm loading audit log into CS2. So audit log into CST. Let me add a string value here. So now in case if I execute this, since all the rows would fail, all the rows would get logged into the fault tolerance file. So let me go to the storage account. Within that container, you would be able to see a new file would get created of fault tolerance in some time once the pipeline gets executed. So it would take some time to execute, but parallelly, let me start creating my database connection. Any queries? I know I'm going parallelly today, but there are too many things, and this is database.windows.net. This is my server name. My database name is delete DB. I'll use the SQL authentication tab. If you see, there is something managed identity that Azure Data Factory supports. Unfortunately, that is yet not supported by Fabric Data Pipelines. Username was the server name in itself. And password. Now let me test the connection before creating that link service. So I'm creating that link service connection. Now it is asking me to select the table name. I'll select address. Now in Azure Data Factory or in Fabric Data Pipeline, in case if your database is at the source, then you get three options. Whether you want to query the table, whether you want to use your own query, or you want to use a stored procedure. So be it Azure Data Factory or Fabric Data Pipeline, whenever your source in the copy activity is an database, then you get the option to query it as a table, read it as a table, or write your own query. So in this case, since I'd already selected that table, or I can write my own query. Select all from. Let's check the new table that I created, auto.copysync. From auto.copysync, and let me preview the data here. Okay, it was auto copy sync fault, correct? Sorry, my fault. Auto copy sync fault. Can you see? I don't see any data. Now let me go and check my pipeline. The pipeline run was successful, but still I'm not able to see the data. Now let's check the logs. The act. Okay, sorry. Which copy activity got executed? It's this one. Can you see rows? There were 2 rows read, but 0 rows copied. 2 rows were copied because I had enabled the fault tolerance. Because of that, my pipeline got executed successfully. And now let me go and check my storage layer. Can you see? A new folder got created called copy activity logs. Within that, the corresponding copy activity name. Within that, some GUID value. Now, what is this GUID value? Is this some specific pipeline run ID or the pipeline ID? Any ideas? It's a random GUID ID that gets created. And then within that, a CS text file gets created. We do not have the control over that. Now, in case if I download this file, and if I open this file, this is the data that I get. That exception occurred when converting value ABC for column for type string, meaning it provides each and every logs of the incompatible rows that got executed. This is the copy activity fault tolerance settings. So that imagine that you want to continue your flow of copy, even if there are some incompatible rows, but you want to log the incompatible rows. That's when you use the fault tolerance property. Queries. Yes or no?
Yes.
So any queries, team? Can you see there is an add dynamic content option here in Azure Data Factory, correct? Custom and add dynamic content. So in add dynamic content, what I can do is under functions, UTC now. So the test column would be populated as UTC now. Unfortunately, I'm unable to get that drop down here in this copy activity additional columns. But I hope you all understood, correct? How you can map the additional value. So rather than okay, it was down, my fault. Correct? If you see, now I can provide a value, like a fixed value for all the columns. You cannot have row by row different values in the additional column. Whatever additional column you select, whatever value, it would be common for all the rows in that. So now audit log would populate UTC now. So rather than copies, I'll copy it into copy sync as my destination. Since copy sync CS2 column is varchar, So now once I execute this, I'll be able to see my current date value there.
So Nandan, hello. What if I need to provide a row number?
You cannot. You have to, for that, you have Azure, you have Dataflow Gen 2 or Notebook for additional
Okay.
transformations. The copy activity is only to copy the data as is from source to destination without any
Transformation.
transformations.
Yes.
Clear?
Yeah. And Nandan,
So,
one question I have on mapping. Okay. So as like it's a manual mapping we have done so far, right? So
correct.
can we leverage dynamic mapping? Suppose we
Yes, you
have
can.
multiple
You can
CSV
leverage. Yes, you
files.
can leverage.
So how do we do that? Can you show us, please?
Correct. Yes. So now, since this got executed, let me execute this query. Okay, which table did I select? Copy sync, sorry, it was in copy sync. Okay. Okay, that went into fault tolerance. Let me check the logs of the copy activity. Rows copied were 0. Let me create another table varchar 25 copy sync 1. Let me copy this into copy sync 1 and let me execute it. So now you should see the default date time. So let it get executed. Post that, we'll take a look with respect to the query. So while this executing, the question was, can I add dynamic mapping? Correct. The answer to that is yes, you can add dynamic content. Meaning, let me show in the Azure Data Factory by the time. In the mapping, there is an option wherein you can add a dynamic content. You can provide the corresponding values for the corresponding set of mappings. Any queries?
So only in ADF, not in Fabric.
It's the same, correct? If you check the properties, it's the same. Can you see any difference in
Okay,
this?
yeah,
In
I
this?
need, yeah, I can so see, yeah, below, yeah.
Correct, it's the same. As I said, Azure Data Factory के ऊपर the Fabric data pipelines are. Since this was under execution, I could not import or make the dynamic aspect. Hence, I showed the ADF version. So in case if I execute this now, since it got executed successfully, okay, still the data is getting copied over to some other aspect. Audit log is not getting copied into CS2. Why? Correct. Now, sometimes it becomes difficult. Correct. So best option is to disable this and not skip anything. So in that case, automatically you will get the error message. Why it is not getting copied? Is there something, some property that I might be missing due to audit log UTC? Now let it get executed. So mappings can be dynamic, and I'll have that dynamic mapping demo ready before the next session. That's some complicated aspect on how you can map your dynamic aspect. But a good question. Yes, you can have the mappings dynamic because not every file would have a static values, correct? So you have to make the copy activities dynamic every time as a metadata driven architecture. So that advanced aspect we'll see in the next session.
Thank you.
but it is possible via dynamic mappings. So now the copy activity failed. Invalid column length. Okay, because I have made it varchar 25 and date time has a significant upper value. Create table. 100 is not the value, it's somewhere around 50. Let's see. So now this should get executed successfully. So any queries now on the copy activity? We have covered all the properties of the copy activity: source, destination, mappings, and settings. Is there any query? Now, depending upon source and destination, which source and which destination you all are selecting, some of the properties would get added or would get removed. So for that, I won't be able to cover each and every source, correct? There are more than 50 sources. So for that, as and when you come across that corresponding source or link, you can refer the corresponding Microsoft documentation for that corresponding feature value in case if you all have any confusion. But 90% of the properties I've already covered that are common across all source and sinks, like additional columns, mappings, fault tolerance, etc. And in general, I explained you all the concept of when there is a file as a source or some table of a structured database as a source or a sink. Which are our main cases like Lakehouse, Fabric Warehouse, Fabric SQL database. It can either be a file or a table within the same. So any queries? Now it got executed. Now can you see the corresponding default value got added? The UTC now value got added. So this is with respect to the copy activity. Any queries on copy activity? Okay.
Break.
No, today there won't be a break.
Okay.
So now we covered the aspects of copy activity. Now, one aspect that I wanted to cover is, see, imagine that as of now I connected to a storage account, correct? And the connection is hard coded here. When I say hard coded, meaning I've explicitly selected the storage account. Imagine that every time I want to parameterize it, is it possible to update the connection aspect? There is an option to dynamic, but there are certain limitations which we'll take a look. But before that, let me create another copy activity. Now, up till now, we have taken sources that were external sources. Now, let me take an internal source, which is Lakehouse. So under my one lake, I want to copy the data from my Fabric SQL database. SQL database is a tabular model, hence you have three options: table, query, and stored procedure. And you can select the corresponding table accordingly, similar to what we had seen for the Azure SQL database. And then in the advanced aspect, it's the same set of aspects that you want in the table. So I'll select sales LT customer table. Now my destination also, rather than this, I want to use another Lakehouse. So I want to copy the data into the Lakehouse table, into the Lakehouse 1. Now in Lakehouse 1, do I want to load it as a file which we had already seen? And while loading the file, what type of file do I want to load it as? Avro, binary, delimited, JSON, ORC, or PAT. I want to load it as a table. Now, do I already have a table or do I want to create a new table? I want to create a new table called customer in Lakehouse 1. In Lakehouse, do I want to append the data, override the data, or upsert the data? Upsert data is in preview mode as of now. So now this is a simple copy, correct? I'm copying the data from an Azure from a Fabric SQL database into the Lakehouse tables. So now in case if I execute this, a table would get created in the Lakehouse. And in case if the table is getting created, meaning a Delta Parquet file actually is getting created in the backend behind the table. So now let me connect to another. Let me connect to Power BI via my another account, that is takeover account, the user 2 account parallelly by the time that is getting executed. Takeover.
Tables from SQL, it can be like we can load it as a files
As files
as
in
you
the
showed.
Lakehouse. Yes, there was files option as well, correct? Yes, you can.
Yeah. Okay.
And whatever
Then
type of
what is
file.
so what will be the use of that? Like when we loading table as a file in Lakehouse in practical scenario.
Now you tell me what can be. Can someone tell what can be the practical scenario in this case? See, imagine that you being the okay, sorry. Imagine that you being the data owner of a database, some downstream vendor, correct? Some analytical team want their data in a JSON format only, correct? So in that case, they do not have the means to connect to a Fabric SQL database. They can only read JSON files as their input source. So at that time, you are bound to provide them the data in the JSON file format itself, correct?
Yes, to share someone to end user, right?
It depends on the downstream. And
Okay.
and in this world, even if you see the means, correct? How many reports you have created? The end question that the customer asks is, can you export it into Excel?
Yes.
Correct. So depending upon the use case, depending upon the downstreams, the user requirements might change. So at that time, rather than the table aspect, you are forced to provide them the data in the file format itself. Clear?
Yes.
Okay, my fault. See, I copied the copy activity as is, but I didn't delete the mappings. And there is no columns like that, correct? So I'll reset the mappings. I'll delete the mappings since I want to copy it as this as a new source. So now this should get executed. I hope you understood what the fault was. I copied the copy activity and cloned the copy activity. In that there were mappings, but those mappings are not present in the new source and destination, because of which it failed. Now it should get executed successfully. Now, in the delete trial capacity, by the time the pipeline is getting executed, in the delete trial capacity, under manage access, the takeover account does not have access. So let me add the takeover account as a contributor. The pipeline got executed successfully. Parallel, let me go to the pipeline. So now the pipeline got executed successfully, and in the Lakehouse, you would be able to see the table in Lakehouse 1. In Lakehouse 1, I can see a customer table that's now unidentified because now it is getting synced properly. But now if you see, customer 1 table has been created. But imagine that to your question, correct? Can I copy it as files? Yes, you can copy it as files. Let me browse it into the Parquet folder. Within Parquet folder, I want it to be a, let's say, JSON file, correct? And every file has its own settings, correct? Now under copy behavior, whenever your destination is a file format, you would see this copy behavior: flatten file, merge file, preserve hierarchy. What does this mean? Merge files. Imagine that in your source also is a file aspect itself, and you have a folder that you have mapped, and you want to copy all the files within the folder into the sink. In that case, if you want to keep all the files separately as is, and even the subfolders as is, at that time you will state preserve hierarchy. Meaning, let's say that in your input, your folder structure is, you have a folder 1 that contains file 1, file 2, and a subfolder. Within that subfolder, there are 2 files, file 3 and file 4. Now, if you remember the copy activity, that was recursively. What does that recursively do? It copies all the files across all the folders, subfolders into the sink. Now imagine that in your sink, if you want to have that hierarchy of folder, subfolder as is, at that time you will state preserve hierarchy. But imagine that rather than having multiple files, you want a single file. At that time you will say merge files. So all the files would get merged into a single file. And flatten hierarchy. Now what does flatten hierarchy mean? Imagine that you have a JSON file, a semi-structured data. Correct? JSON is a semi-structured data. You want to flatten that JSON into a normal CSV file. At that time you will use flatten hierarchy. So it would try to convert the JSON into the corresponding CSV file format. It would flatten it. Now this is very advanced concept of flattening a JSON, etc. that I won't cover, but just so that you all would remember, there are some concepts wherein you can even explicitly convert nested JSONs. So now, since I want to preserve the hierarchy, or I don't want anything, I want to keep it as is, meaning it would go to the default behavior of maintaining it as is. Now I want the file name. I won't provide any file name. Let's see what happens. Now I'm executing this pipeline. That is to answer to Ramesh your query that can files be created from table? The answer to that is yes. Now, let me log in via the takeover account. Let me go to the workspace. Since it got recently added, let me refresh the cache. Now I'll be able to see the delete trial capacity workspace. In the delete trial capacity workspace, let me go to pipeline 1 now. The pipeline 1 is loading. It takes some time, but the copy activity got executed successfully. Under Parquet, let me refresh. Can you see sales80.customer.json file? A JSON file got created with the corresponding data. Clear?
Yes.
So now in case I logged in via takeover2 account. If I click this copy activity, it is copying between source and sink. Correct? Meaning it's copying within the Fabric ecosystem itself. Whereas let me enable this and let me deactivate this. Now, when I click on this, can you see here? Fail to load the connection. Please make sure it exists and you have permission to access it. And in the destination also. What does that mean? So it is copy CSV1. Correct? Let me go back to my pipeline 1 here. Let me deactivate this and let me activate this, wherein I have an Azure SQL database and a storage account. And let me just save this as of now. I don't want to run this. So now let me refresh the page in the takeover 2 account. By the time that is getting executed, see, up till now I have been creating multiple connections. Agree? Where are those connections getting preserved? So under the settings, click on the settings. Under that, you can see something called as manage connections and gateways. So click on manage connections and gateways, so that you would get the list of all the connections that you all or the users have created. So I have these many connections that I have created. Now in that case, let's check which connection this copy activity is using. Pipeline 1, correct? So in pipeline 1, I have multiple connections that I have created. Okay. Now can you see the message that you cannot access one or more connections in this data pipeline? You can either ask the data pipeline owner to grant permission to all the connections used in the data pipeline or other connection that you cannot access. See, the takeover 2 user also has contributor access within this workspace, meaning he or she can go and edit the pipelines and preserve the pipelines or even delete the pipelines. Even though the corresponding user is having contributor access, still the user cannot make changes in the corresponding pipeline. Can you see? It is not allowing him to save the pipeline. But can the user run the pipeline? Okay, since a change was made, let me refresh this. So
But it
now
said contributor can do all things, right?
I'll come to that. Yes. Ideally, a contributor at a workspace level should be able to modify the pipelines and other aspects. Correct? The answer to that is yes, he can do that changes. But in this case, there is an advanced concept of connection that comes in. If you see, in this copy activity, I had created this connection called storage or shortcut storage account and deleted SQL Shark data, some 2 new connections. Now, whenever you create a connection, it gets created, and in that the user is just that account who had created that connection. Since it was the Data Sharks user who had created this connection, it's only he who is the user of that connection as of now. It's because of that when the takeover user or the second user, even though he has contributor, let's say even if he has admin access or owner access within the workspace, still he won't be able to edit the pipeline, because as the error message suggests that there are certain connections. If you see source connection and destination connection, both are some GUID number. But here you can see that the source connection and the sync connection has certain name. But here it is showing it as a GUID value, because this user does not have access to that connection. Does that mean that he cannot edit the pipeline? Yes, unfortunately, he cannot edit and save the pipeline. But can he run the pipeline? Yes, even if the user does not have access to the connection, he or she can run the pipeline as long as it is above the viewer role. So if you see, the pipeline is getting executed, but the user with contributor and above role or permission won't be able to edit the pipeline until and unless he or she gets access on those connections. Now, what to do? You can see, correct? The pipeline got executed successfully, but the user was not able to edit the pipeline and preserve the pipeline. So now, let's take a look here.
But there was an error, right, in the connection. So how can like it will be run?
It's because it is running. If you remember the concept owner and takeover, do you remember the concept of owner and takeover? What I mean is,
Yeah.
at the workspace level, when the pipeline 1 was created, the pipeline is owned by this account and this account has access to the connection. So it's via this ownership that that pipeline is running. So anyone who has access to run the pipeline can run the pipeline because the pipeline is getting executed via this owner concept, not the corresponding account. So even if for that user, there is a failure in the connection aspect, it's this account's ownership that is being considered while running it. And as long as the second user has access to run the pipeline, he or she can run the pipeline. But he or she cannot modify the pipeline because of that connection issue. So how to manage that aspect? So for that, as I said, under connections, the user who has created the connection, correct? It is his or her responsibility to share it with other users within that workspace who have contributor or contributor and above access. Meaning, now in case if I want to copy this, if I want to check deleted SQL Server data sharks, this is the connection name. Let me find that connection name. Deleted SQL Server data sharks. Can you see this is the connection name? In this connection, there is only one user, that is the data sharks account. So now I have to click here. Click on manage users. Under manage user, add additional users. So in this case, I want to provide take owner account. Select that account. What type of access do I want to provide? Do I want the user to use it in his connections? So in this case, yes, I want him to use it for other aspects. Do you want that user to use it and share it with others? Or do you want to allow the user to edit the configurations of that connections? So in this case, I want the user to only use the connection, not make any edits. So I'll provide him with user access and I'll click on share. So now this connection is being shared with the secondary account. This account. Now can you see the users are the data sharks and the takeover. Now in case if I refresh this page,
It will show original data source.
it will show the connection name rather than the value because that connection has been shown. So if you see under destination, the connection is now preserved. But since I've still not shared the source connection, it is in failed state. So now I also have to share the source connection. And now in case if I go to the connections, manage connections of this account, I'll be able to see the new connection that got added. Can you see delete SQL Server? Now, once I share the other connection with this user, what is the other connection name? It's short UCT. It's SHORT UCT. It's this one. Correct. Now, under manage user, take over. Now I'll give it owner access just for validation sake, so that you understand what is happening. I'll share it. Now, in case if I go back to the secondary user, if I refresh this page, I'll see the secondary connection got added. Now, under setting, this user can now go and change the connection details or the configuration, because I made him or her the owner of this connection. But here, if I click on settings, this is grayed only because I had enabled that user to just use it. No edit properties. Now, in case if I go to the pipeline 1, I no longer get that error. Now I can go and edit the pipeline and save it. This is the concept of connections and preserving the aspect.
So Nandan, without sharing connections, access on connections, contributor can run the pipeline, right?
Anyone above contributor or above role can run the pipeline but cannot modify the pipeline.
Okay. So only whenever we need to there is a need to modify the pipeline, then we can share the connection access.
No, that is wrong, correct? Ideally, anyone who has contributor access at a workspace level, he or she should be able to edit or modify anything. It's because of this connection restriction that even the admin, imagine that I am a part of the organization, I create the connection, correct? Imagine that I and one of my colleagues are admin within that workspace. But as a production aspect, I created that connection,
Yes.
correct? Now everything is running. But my second colleague, who is also the admin, won't be able to modify anything. Correct? Imagine I left the organization. Now the connection was under my account.
Yes.
Now, since I left the organization, since the connection is no longer available for anyone, what has to be done is, unfortunately, the second colleague has to create the connection again manually, explicitly. But in case if I had shared it with that colleague, then there would not have been any issue. Understood? So
Yes.
ideally, in case if you have a contributor and above role, it is your responsibility once you create a connection to share it with all the members, at least as a user, not edit, but at least you can share it as a user for that connection.
Yeah, got it. So eliminating these like issues, can we not use service principle?
Unfortunately, as of today, service principle, you cannot create a connection. There is an automated way via which you can create a service principle. But irrespective of service principle, you still have to share it with the users, correct? You would be logging into the Fabric portal and creating the data pipeline, correct? So until unless you are as a user within that connection, you cannot proceed with the development. Even if you create that connection via service principle, still that connection has to be shared.
Yes.
Understood?
Yeah.
So team, any queries on the concept of connections? So as an organizational or as a workspace lead or a Fabric admin, it is your responsibility to strategize this aspect that user developers would be stupid enough or blind enough to create their own connections for the temporary phase and state that the delivery is done. But with respect to business continuity, you all need to understand whether that developer who had created that connection has shared that connection with other users or not. It is the responsibility of the admins, the Fabric admin, admin to ensure that everything is shared. Any queries?
No, Nandan.
So this is with respect to copy activity and connections. Any queries? So copy activity is the main activity that helps one copy the data in the data pipeline, that helps one copy the data from one location to another location. Any queries?
No, Nandan.
Then,
I don't.
then comes data flow activity. Data flow is the data flow gen 2 that can be used for transformations that we would cover in the next session. Notebook is to integrate that notebook wherein we can do the transformations within the data pipeline control flow. Now we saw set variable activity. Then there is something called as up variable activity. Now let me create a new pipeline itself. So up till now we saw copy activity, wait activity, data flow activity, and notebook activity we would cover in the next session in detail. We saw wait activity and we saw fail activity. Now let's understand what is append variable activity. For that, I have to first declare a variable. Let me declare a variable called var array. Let it be of type string. You'll understand why I am stating. Let me create a parameter called p1 and let me create it as a semicolon b semicolon c. Now let me create another variable called final and let it be of type string. Let it be of type array itself. Now in the append variable only supports adding variables of type array. So let me convert this to array. As the name suggests, I want to append the variable. Set variable activity, what it does is, it overrides the variable every time it gets executed within the iteration. We all saw that in the last session, correct? But imagine that if I want to preserve values and keep on appending the values in the existing variable, at that time, unfortunately, I cannot use string variable type. I need to use an array so that it preserves every iteration as a separate array value. And for that, I cannot use set variable because set variable as overwrites the value. So in that case, we have something called as append variable activity. Now let's take a look on append variable activity. But for that, as I said, I need to append it. I need to append it in loops so that you understand that the values are not getting overwritten. So in case if I want a loop activity, there is a for each activity. So in for each activity is similar to your for loop, wherein you have fixed number of iterations. So under settings, a for each activity can either be sequential or parallel. Meaning if I want to execute the loops in sequence or in parallel, in this case, I'll keep it sequential. Item meaning I want to provide the iteration values that it should take across. So I'll add a dynamic content. Meaning for a for each item, it should be an array value so that it would iterate in the array aspect. I'll use a function called split function. Split function splits the string using a separator and converts it into an array. So I'll use my parameter and I'll split it based on the semicolon value that I had used. So now, if you see my parameter is a semicolon b semicolon c. Now I split it based on the semicolon. So it is a, b, c, which are three different array values. So now, within the for each, I want to execute certain activities. So now let me execute a wait activity. And let me execute this. So this is for each activity. Now the for each activity would be executed 3 times because I'm splitting the string into 3 values, A, B, and C separately. So it would iterate 3 times. Since it is sequential, it is executing it in a sequence. So there were 3 executions. Now let's understand the concept of set variable activity and append variable activity. Now let me create 2 additional variables, final array, var string, final string. So now within this, let me use a set variable activity, and in set variable activity, let me add the var string value, string. And here, imagine that I want what is the current iteration value, meaning, let's say that in for each loop, you begin with I equal to 0, greater than 2, I plus plus, and you write a corresponding code. So in that time, what you're stating is your for each loop should start from 0. Oh, sorry, not greater than, less than 2. So I first iteration would be 0, second iteration would be 1, and then it would third iteration would be 2. 2 is not less than 2, it would exit. So there are 2 iterations. And in every iteration, if I say I want to print the value of I, so I would get 0, 1. Similarly, imagine that if I want to get the corresponding iteration value, meaning on what value it is getting iterated, or I'm not talking about iteration value, meaning iteration. Okay. Let me say it starts with 10 and less than 12. So the first value would be 10, second value would be 11. So if I want the corresponding value on which it is getting iterated, so for that, there is a value called under dynamic content. Can you see for each one current item? So it gives me the current iteration value. Now I'll use a set variable activity. Oh, sorry, not set variable, an append variable activity. And I'll append the varchar array and the same iteration, the current iteration value. Post the for each execution, let me use 2 set variable activities. In this set variable, I am assigning the final string value of the var string that I'm assigning within the for each loop. And in the set variable 3, I'm assigning the final array, the value that I'm appending, the variable that I'm appending in the within the for each loop. Now let me execute this pipeline. This would help you understand the difference between a set variable activity and an append variable activity. So any queries up till now? If you see, within the for each, I have these executions in a sequential aspect. So if let me order by run start. Append variable, set variable are both executed parallelly. Now if you see the output, set variable that contains your string, correct, contains the output A. Whereas here, the append variable does not have any output because it never has any output. It is appending, which is not displayed outside. Then again in the next iteration append variable is blank, but if you see the input is B. And in set variable also the input is B. Sorry. In the set variable also the input is B and the output is B. Now we are outside for each activity now within set variable to set variable 3. Now if you see the set variable 2, it took the latest iteration value of the variable, because every time the variable was getting overridden in the set variable activity within the for each. So the final value for that is C. But in case of append variable, can you see it appended all the values as an array A, B, and C? So in case if you want to append your variables in an iteration, append values within a variable in an iterative way, at that time you use append variable value. Whereas if you want to override the variable value, you use set variable value. So any queries on the concept of append variable? Yes or no? Now, rather than sequential, if I make it parallel, let me run this. And in case if I want to view the run history, I can check the corresponding run history which had succeeded. Under here, I can check the Gantt chart and you can see set variable which was the parent and it got executed for this much duration. Within that, every time in every iterations, there was an append variable, set variable activity that was getting executed for this much duration. Post for each activity, then set variable 3 and set variable 2 both got executed successfully. This is the Gantt chart that we were discussing yesterday. Now, let me go back to the pipeline. And if you check the output, now, can you see the initial input is C? Because it was parallel. So it randomly allocated, randomly took the corresponding value, C. And if I check the final output, ACB is it how it got iterated within append variable activity. Unlike ABC, because it was parallel. In parallel, we do not know which iteration comes. It can be executed parallelly. So, any queries on the concept of set variable activity for I'll take additional half an hour now. Post that, we'll close the session. So, we understood the concept of set variable and append variable activity. Similar to for each loop, there is an until loop and if conditions, etc. Now the other main aspect so in the next session, we would be covering some of the other activities, some of the critical activities like invoke pipeline, web activity, get metadata activity. But before the next session, I would request you all to go across the Microsoft documentation of each and every activity that I'll share today. Those are basic 5 or 6 liners across each activity. You will understand based on the definition itself. And then in case if you all feel I need to explain you all specific activity, you all can inform. Else in the next activity, I'll be covering, in the next session, I'll be covering if condition, invoke pipeline, web activity only. If you want some and get metadata activity. And in case if you want some other activity to be explained, you all can reach out, you all can inform me during that session itself. And then we would be covering something called as triggering the pipeline via add trigger functionality. And finally, there was something called as the gateway concept in copy activity. Now, in layman terminology, if I have to explain what the gateway is, imagine that your source data or your destination data is present in an on-premise ecosystem or anything that is bound within a virtual network. So at that time, the data pipeline cannot directly access those source or sinks. You need a bridge that would allow the data pipeline to go within the network bound source. That bridge is what we call as gateway. Since up till now, the Azure SQL database, the Azure storage account were publicly accessible, or we had enabled that allow Azure services property to be enabled. It is because of that Fabric data pipeline was able to access those sources without any gateway because they were publicly accessible for the Microsoft pipelines. But imagine if your database is hosted within the network or on-premises databases, at that time the data pipeline cannot directly connect. There would be an error stating network connectivity issue. At that time you need a bridge. That bridge is what we call as data gateway, and that is what we will take a look in the next session. So any queries on what we all covered today?